Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." And they asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'the time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." And then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify, so make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed, even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your life." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. Pray with me. Oh God, we have heard of wars and rumors of wars all our lives, and there are earthquakes and famines as there have always been. Will you teach us in this hour how you want us to live, no matter what is occurring in the world around us? We ask that for Christ's sake, for your kingdom's sake, and for our sake. You think the word apocalypse refers to a fictional superhuman in comic books? Or do you think it refers to the final complete destruction of the world as we know it? Or do you think it refers to a revelation, a revealing of things that were previously unknown? Turns out, it does refer to a superhuman creature in Marvel comic books. This, in case you didn't know, is Apocalypse. I didn't know it, but the things we learn preparing for sermons. And Apocalypse does refer to the end of the world as we know it. But the word apocalypse is a Greek word, and it means revelation. The revealing, the unveiling of things that were previously not known. And Wikipedia says that apocalyptic literature describes the author's visions of end times as revealed by an angel or other heavenly messenger. Today's gospel is frequently called Jesus' apocalyptic discourse because he talked about wars and earthquakes and signs of heaven in language that sounded to his listeners like the end of time, the end of the world. Many chapters before the chapter we just read, Jesus said, "I must go to Jerusalem, and I will suffer many things, and I will be killed, and I will be raised on the third day." Well, now he was in Jerusalem, and he was in the temple. The first Jewish temple was constructed by King Solomon, but it was destroyed in the year 586 by Nebuchadnezzar. So the second temple was built on the same site and completed 70 years later. And it stayed in that condition until Herod became king over Judea, and then he, with a substantial ego, decides he wants to renovate this baby. He wants to double its size. People said it would become 35 acres within the confines of those outer walls. That was his goal. So the construction began 19 years before Jesus. It continued throughout the years of Jesus' ministry, and it wasn't finished until the year 64, 30 years after Jesus' ministry. Now, if you think you have problems with renovations with your contractor, you don't know what you're talking about. But the people, they were speaking about the temple. The text says how it was adorned with stones, and you might think it was adorned with little jewels stuck in the stones. No. They were amazed at the beauty, the magnificence, the size of these enormous rectangular white stones that were being used in the renovation of the temple. And Jesus said, "But I tell you, these things that you see, not one stone will be left upon another. They will all be thrown down." And that event would have sounded like the end of the world to the Jewish people. And so they asked, "Teacher, when will these things happen? What are the signs that the end is nigh?" And then Jesus gave them his apocalyptic discourse. The first thing he said was, "Beware that you are not led astray by false prophets, saying the time of the end is near." Now, there were false prophets that said that after Moses' death, in Jeremiah's time, and there are false prophets who say the end of time is near in our time. Some of you will remember that in the 1970s, a man named Hal Lindsey wrote this book, The Late Great Planet Earth. It sold 15 million copies. And in it, he said the end of the world is imminent because Israel has been reconstituted as a nation. There are wars and rumors of wars in the Middle East, and there are increasing numbers of natural disasters. Well, it wasn't imminent, was it? That was 1970s. But now, in our world, there is a Messianic Jew. So this is a Jewish person who believes in Jesus, who you can hear on radio stations around the country and a few abroad every day of the week. And he has published the book, The Harbinger. His name is Jonathan Cahn, C-A-H-N, and his teaching is that we are in the end times now because of the apostasy of America in abolishing its moral principles. So the false prophets, one kind of false prophets say the end is near. But Jesus said, what did he say about that? No one knows the time or the date, not the angels in heaven, nor even the Son himself, but only the Father. There's a different kind of false prophets. These are false prophets who say that the persecution and suffering that Jesus' disciples would have experienced in the early days of Christianity, he was talking about sufferings that they would experience, and they did, and was Luke in this gospel was trying to give them comfort and courage. But they say that's not God's purpose now. That suffering has been done, and what God's primary purpose is now is to bless us materially. These are the television preachers of the prosperity gospel. And instead of talking about mansions in heaven, they talk about mansions on earth. This structure is the home of Reverend Jesse Duplantis. He is the head. He founded the Covenant megachurch in Destrehan, Louisiana. and that's his home. He also has a jet that costs $54 million. The prosperity evangelists never talk about Jesus saying we need to take up our cross and follow him. And the theology that they present doesn't talk about the persecution that Jesus described. He said his followers would be arrested and persecuted, imprisoned, brought before magistrates, betrayed by their relatives and friends, and some of you will be put to death. But you don't hear that from the prosperity evangelists. The suffering that the early Christians experienced related to the time in which they lived. Nowadays, there are very few Christians in the United States who suffer, at least physically, because they follow Jesus, right? But the purpose of following Jesus is not to suffer, is it? The purpose of following Jesus is to give our lives away in ways that God enables us to give them away. Ways to help the needy, especially the poor, the children, the homeless, the imprisoned, the refugees, and so on. Now, giving our lives in ways like that may not bring suffering now, but it probably at times will bring some sacrifice. It will require sacrifice. In February of 1994, the Chicago police, on a drug investigation, they discovered 19 children living in a 2-room apartment with no adult anywhere around. It was the most disturbing example of child abuse and neglect you could imagine. The stench of soiled diapers, the mounds of dirty clothes, a clogged toilet, rotting food. It was the most disturbing example of childhood abuse and neglect you can imagine. Well, 10 years later, in February 2004, the Chicago Tribune published a follow-up of those children. 5 of the 19 were brothers, and the Department of Children and Family Services thought it was important to keep those 5 brothers together in the same home until their mother completed her jail sentence. Each of the children had a different father, and none of the fathers were anywhere in the picture. And so a woman named Claudine Christian said she had taken the 5 boys for 3 months, but they still lived with her 10 years later. When they arrived at ages 2, 5, 6, 8, and 9, it was all hell in her house, in her neat bungalow in Hopkins Park. They didn't know what mealtime was. They didn't know how to use utensils. They ate with their fingers. Claudine bought 2 sets of bunk beds for them, and they refused to get in them. They slept in their bedroom on the floor, huddled together in a pile covered by a blanket. The boys fought. They destroyed household items, and her husband, who was already unhappy, said he gave her an ultimatum. He said, "It's either me or the boys." And I love it. She chose the boys. She set some boundaries, according to the newspaper, assigned simple chores and set expectations. The boys started to go to school. There were innumerable challenges and setbacks, but she endured. She took the boys to her church, and one by one they were baptized. The paper said their academic and their behavioral challenges continued 10 years later, but the boys were making it. They were participating in extracurricular activities, they were singing in the choir, and a couple were junior deacons in their church. At the end of the article, Claudine Christian described those terrible, harrowing days when the boys first came to her house, when they slept in the center of their bedroom floor in spite of the bunk beds that sat empty. She said their sleep was fitful, it was broken by nightmares. And she remembers they would wake up in the middle of the night, and I would run into the room and I would gather 2 or 3 of them at a time and just hold them and rock them until they could sleep again. I would say, I love you, I love you, I love you. She said, you just say it until it sticks. She said, you can't play with these words when you're dealing with children. She was giving her life in sacrificial ways that gave life to those 5 boys. It's all we have in the world. It's an alternative way of living, a way of giving our lives in ways that are a complete difference with the values of the world that we live in, a way of living that would make no sense if Jesus had not been here. He ended his apocalyptic discourse about the difficulties his followers would experience by saying, by your endurance, you will gain your lives. He did not mean you will earn your salvation. Jesus took care of that. He meant that you will be living the kind of life with an eternal quality about it, that God wants us to live in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.